Thank you so much. We're probably the only people stopping you from here and drinks, so I'll be sure to make this quick, but hopefully you'll be able to learn a lot and really be able to take a lot of these tidbits and produce this in your own organization. We're going to be talking about mini tabletops and what is that, where did it come from, and really the whole point is we want to give autonomy to organizations to be able to do this themselves. It's not a replacement of our general tabletops, it's just we're realizing having one scenario happen throughout the entire year, it's just not enough with the threat landscape that's happening. So we want to continually have new threat scenarios. There's new ways of doing these threat actors are happening across the cloud platforms, on-prem. The threat landscape is changing, therefore we should try to have a new concept to try to have mini tabletops where you can have them multiple times in a year throughout the year with different scenarios as opposed to just having a one time a year. So we're going to talk a little bit about some introductions of myself and Simran and kind of what are tabletop exercises so we can level set expectations, right? When we say tabletop, it may mean something else when we're in the different industries, different organizations. What is tabletops? What consists of tabletops, and why do you want to do tabletops? Then we're going to get into what is a mini tabletop, how does that differ from a regular tabletop exercise, and then get into giving the autonomy to the organization, how to plan, how to scope, how to facilitate a tabletop exercise. Like a facilitator's role is one of the key roles within an organization for a tabletop, and then how to take those findings, those gaps that you realize in the tabletop, and be able to produce a plan that's actionable, that we can take those gaps and turn them into fill those gaps up. And then we have a gameplay, so that might be some of the fun parts where we have a little bit of competition on some real cool scenarios of what we get from a tabletop, but also what we see on the front lines. Quick little background. My name is Nader Zaveri. I'm a senior manager with our Security Transformational Services practice, STS. This practice is fairly unique. We have a unique role where we're part of the IR team. We're the containment and remediation arm. So during an IR, you have an investigative team investigating what's happening in terms of the incident. Then we're there at the same time, hand in hand, trying to contain, remediate, and kick out the attacker. Another function of our team that makes us very unique is we also do a lot of proactive engagements, security assessments, secure architecture assessments, and being able to be part of tabletop exercises, being the subject matter experts around cloud tabletops and other forms of tabletop exercises. Simran?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know we're definitely the last stop between you and the bar, so we appreciate you. My name is Simran Sakraney. Very happy to be with you today. I'm actually from the strategic services side of Mandiant, so I like to think of our team as the first stop on your cybersecurity journey. I have plenty of experience within the private and public sectors throughout the last 5-6 years, and we lead a variety of engagements providing customers with the tools and expertise that they need to reduce risks, minimize breach impact, and protect against future attacks, which I personally think tabletops help clients do pretty well. And our team does quite a few of them, so the idea for mini tabletops really came from the discussion with different CISOs and just hearing what clients needed and realizing that they wanted to do these more and like shorter time frames, maybe through brown bag sessions. And usually, when you ask a CISO, what keeps you up at night when you're scoping an engagement, you're scoping a tabletop exercise, they give you like 10 different things. And I'm like, okay, we can do maybe 5. If we get crafty, we can do 7. So this way we can, cover a larger portion of that list. So what are tabletops? Before I go into that, I know a lot of you probably already know what tabletops are. A lot of us are in the cybersecurity industry ourselves. So could I have a raise of hands? Who has done a tabletop before? Okay, awesome. So tabletop exercises do provide an opportunity to discuss the steps that would be involved in responding to a real-world cybersecurity incident. So we want to figure out where the gaps are before a breach would occur, because you really don't want to be in the middle of an IR wondering how to do like an enterprise password reset. That would be pretty inconvenient and stressful, as you could probably imagine. And tabletops are really designed to foster constructive discussions among all the participants and look at the operational plans, the incident response plans, any documentation that you have, and figure out if that's actually what you would be doing in an IR. Because oftentimes really, clients have things documented, but they're not actionable. And a lot of IR plans are 30, 40, 50 pages. You don't have the time and the energy, the bandwidth to go through all that during a tabletop. So it's good to get things really niched in and succinct so that when the time comes, your team is prepared. So I like to think of tabletops as kind of like a simulation of a real incident, and the more you practice, the closer to perfect you're going to get.
Now, we've asked if you've done a tabletop before. Now, who's done a tabletop in the past year? Keep your hands raised. In the past 6 months? So this is where, when you have mini tabletops, having that regular, okay, Mandiant people cannot answer this question. That's not fair. So now we know what is a tabletop. We want to level set expectations. Now, why do a tabletop? One, it's a great way to see the collaboration between teams, because I can tell you firsthand, during an actual incident, there is a lot of tension in the room internally, where there's a lot of point blaming. There's who owns what asset. If I need to reset this password, who owns this? What server? Who owns this server? What application? These are actual real arguments that happen really during an IR. So this is a kind of a good way to test it out, a good way to compare what is said on their actual IR plan, if you do have an IR plan, and actually what happens during a mock scenario like a tabletop. You want to also provide a succinct way. So usually when we're giving our workshops, we talk about one attack path, right? Hey, if you were to have this misconfiguration here, this is what could happen. But now what we try to do with the tabletop is go through an entire attack lifecycle, from the initial access all the way possibly to exfiltration, which you won't have a lot of chance to do unless you're doing something like a tabletop, which is catered towards that entire attack lifecycle. You want to also explore different pathways that participants have, where you can kind of touch base and probe a little bit of what exactly is happening.
Yeah. Also, it's also very rare to have different functions in the same room at the same time. Yeah. So accounting, software development, cybersecurity, physical security, HR, law. A lot of the times they're probably not going to have these conversations on their own. So the more that, as people come into the organization, the more that you spend time with different teams and you can understand what their role would be and what the escalation paths would be, who would be the right person to contact, and if the right person that you would contact is not available, who the backup would be, is really important to discuss beforehand.
Yep, and one thing we always know is a lot of times organizations are trying to do that checkbox tabletop, right? And this says you need to do one tabletop a year, I'm gonna just do that checkbox. And that's a lot of times what brings us in, which is they need to comply with regulatory frameworks, but this is really an inexpensive way of truly testing your incident response plan, because you don't want to be on the wrong end of it where you're having to actually respond, which can have a price tag up in the millions or more. So having a really inexpensive way to really test out not only your incident response plan, your collaboration, but as Simran mentioned, there's a lot of times where you need communications in the same room with legal counsel, with your external counsel, with your CISO and your different functions inside, and that doesn't really happen until an incident or something like a tabletop.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone ever participated in an executive tabletop? Okay, not that many. So there are two different types of tabletops, technical and executive. And the technical tabletop exercise, it's very nitty-gritty, getting into the weeds, looking at the attack lifecycle, looking at logs, things like that, policies, procedures. You have a lot of SMEs in the room. So we always try to advocate to make sure that whatever application we're outaging in the scenario, we try to make sure that that account owner is in the room, because it gets really awkward when they're not. Because the facilitator would be like, great, so where are the backups for that application? When was the last time it was backed up? Do we have that person in the room? Can we call them? Oftentimes, we'll we'll be doing tabletops, and they'll actually, not have the contact information. They'll have to call that person and, get them on the Zoom call, and we're doing an in-person tabletop. So it's a great exercise in that sense. We also go through all the compliance portions and, figuring out the chain of custody really, and how to make sure you're not, messing with the evidence, because if it does become a lawsuit, your legal counsel isn't going to be too happy. And we go through like a lot of the more operational security portions during that technical tabletop exercise. In the executive tabletop exercise, it's a very different audience. It's a lot more high level, and it has more to do with, like, here's a technical briefing. This is what's been going on. What are you going to do about it? And one of my favorite parts of the executive tabletop exercise is discussing with the executives as a group what their stance on, for example, ransomware payments would be. And the first time I did an executive tabletop and they didn't have a stance, I was very surprised. One of them was kind of like, who would make the Bitcoin wallet? Wait, but how is that going to get tracked back to us? And should we ask legal? And a lot of times we will introduce things like, cyber negotiators and breach coaches, and oftentimes clients didn't even realize that was an option they have. We talk about, cyber insurance and how that could be helpful, and as the rates are going up, if it's worth it or not. And we try to make sure that they understand that if they have their backups ready to go and in place, you might not have to go through all that, because you might not be so worried about your data being leaked.
But I can tell you just from the IR side, backups are getting encrypted left and right. That's pretty much now par for the course, or even at the operational level, your entire Active Directory is not even capable of logging in. So those questions, those tough questions at that executive level has to happen. And that great question of, if you get ransomware, are you going to pay or not? A lot of times those questions, are not really thought of because, it can't happen to me. But in reality, it's going to happen. We just need to know how we can limit it and how we can best prepare.
So again, we are here to introduce mini-tabletops as a concept due to conversations we've had with clients and the need for it. We're not in any way trying to replace traditional tabletops and how they're done. There is definitely a whole lot of value in how we do traditional tabletops. Mini-tabletop exercises, I would just like to preface, are probably recommended for more mature organizations that have done plenty of tabletops in the past. They've kind of worked through a lot of the issues, and maybe the list of what keeps that CISO up at night is a little smaller, but they have like known gaps that they would like to work on. So regular tabletop exercises, with the attack surface continuously expanding, there are more threats, but you really only get to cover one type of threat, or maybe two if you get creative, and there's a lot of diversity of scenarios that you could do, but you really need to pick one. So the engagement timeline is definitely longer. It takes about 10, 20 days to go through the planning period. Scenario gameplay is about 4 to 7 hours. It's a little difficult to get folks that are higher up, directors, managers, executives, to be a part of those tabletops, because 4 to 7 hours, they have a lot going on during that time. And the debrief is about 1 to 2 hours. So also, regular tabletops really provide more of a single point in time pulse check. It's not really a great, it doesn't give you a great idea of what the organization's health really looks like. It's really specific to that scenario, and it's kind of difficult to detect patterns and trends that way, because it's biased based on the reactions and the people in the room that showed up and people's moods and the specific scenario, the specific application that was outaged during that scenario. But many tabletop exercises are, you can do it in a package, so you can cover different scenarios, or different, for example, you can do like ransomware. And usually when we do ransomware scenarios in a traditional tabletop, maybe like inject 7, 8 out of 10 to 12 injects, we'll probably start talking about recovery and backups, disasters, and if you have plans for that, what that would look like, how you're going to recover, and the procedures that would be associated. But with many tabletop exercises, you can actually create an entire scenario specifically based on disaster recovery and preparedness. Because a lot of the times we don't really get into the nitty-gritty details of everything. This way you can. And the engagement timeline looks a little different, so it may be easier to get more folks in the room because it's a smaller time frame. It would be about 30 minutes to 2 hours. You can kind of put it, like a brown bag session, order some lunch, and it's good for bonding as well. Reporting really would only take about a day, and you don't necessarily have to have a full-blown report. It could just be quick, slide deck debrief, something a little, more informal. And the executive level debrief would be an hour, and it doesn't necessarily have to be after every mini tabletop exercise. It can happen maybe quarterly or monthly, or depending on how often you do the mini tabletops, it can happen over time. And maybe you do once a month or once a quarter or once every 2 months, and then at the end of the quarter, you have a meeting with a report on how all the tabletops went, what maybe the common strengths were, the common areas of opportunities, and maybe some ideas on how to move forward and fill the gaps. So higher frequency, of course, allows for multiple pulse checks, which helps give a lot more accurate idea of the status of the organization and if what should be prioritized in the next roadmap for example, F23. It also gives a more holistic understanding of the organization's response through multiple scenarios. So it's easier to understand where the gaps are. If maybe you need to hire, more folks in different practices, if certain teams need more support, if you need to look into having a PR firm that specifies in cybersecurity, or maybe you need to spend more time getting to know your legal counsel so you have a better relationship and more trust between the different stakeholders. Also, more data allows for easier detection of patterns and trends, which I think is really important over time.
Yeah, and definitely I think that's the key, right? Where as you get more data, you could see larger patterns and trends that are happening. If we do 3 to 5 scenarios and the consistency is lack of coordination between teams or lack of unknown escalation paths, that's a key trend that we're seeing. Now we can go back to the drawing board. Does our IR plan state this? If it does, is it reflective of what's happening? So this is a way, more data, we love data, and it's about using those data to our advantage. So now we know what is and why do a tabletop and who are the participants and the types of tabletops. We want to look at how to plan it, right? So there's some multiple things to consider during a scenario like this. You want to know the number of participants, right? You want to know the collaboration within the organizations, the different functions that are part of a specific scenario. Who should we be have in the room, and who should we have on call? You want to also know if there needs to be a third party, an external notification that has to happen. Do we need to have a person outside of the actual organization itself be part of this because it may touch their application? You want to know what tools are going to be required. If it touches, if I need to run this query in Splunk, do we have our Splunk SME in the room who knows, okay, if this log alert happens, how are we going to correlate that? Okay, we have to use Splunk, and this is probably what query we would use, or it's in this dashboard. And it'll vary on who can be there depending on the different part of the day. As she mentioned, the brown bag, the lunch and learns. If it's happening at 12 o'clock Eastern, if you have a team in India or a team in APJ, maybe that might not, maybe they won't be able to provide a lot of insight. Maybe a lot of your organization's systems are being owned and assets are being owned in different regions. So being able to coordinate who is there at what time and just different locations. So, one thing with us is when we do tabletops, being in the room, in a boardroom, seeing the different faces and being able to kind of ask these questions. Of course, we live in a very post-COVID world. A lot of things are remote. Doing things remote is just fine. Sometimes it wouldn't require a specific location. And the different personnel, as I mentioned. Each team and application would require a different personnel to be in the room, not just your IR team, right? That one thing we get, wrong is the IR during an incident response is just your IR team that is kind of affected, and they're working around the clock. When we're doing IRs, we have the system admins, the network admins on tap 24/7. We have the CISO. We have, if you're application owner and your application is considered critical and we need to get this up online, the application owner's there on the call at the same time the different personnels and the different scenarios will then dictate who should be in the room.
So scoping tabletop exercises, this is one of my favorite parts of the timeline, just because you really get to sit down with the CISO, with the team, whoever the client POC might be, and you really get to know the organization, the troubles that they're going through. And as consultants, we're kind of here to help you. We're here to make win-win situations, and we're trying to solve problems and make sure that if there was an attack, which it seems like you're gonna get attacked one day, so you might as well get prepared. It's good to have those conversations and talk about what really keeps the CISO up at night, like I was mentioning earlier. So I usually start the conversations with asking the CISO or whoever the POC might be a program manager, might be a director within the organization, and ask them, so what worries you about your program? Where do you think your gaps are? Because of course they're gonna know the environment very intimately because they live and breathe in it at least 5 to 7 times a week. So they're gonna know more than we do. And things to consider when you're having those conversations are environment attributes, right? So the business context and operations. So what are the major business lines? The operations dispersion, can we see an org chart maybe? The team structure, and how does that work? What would the escalation paths be? Are there backups for folks if someone's on PTO, right? I mean, I've done client work where it's a one-person incident response team, and we've asked them, so who's going to take care of things if you mentioned you're going to Peru next week? If you're at Machu Picchu hiking up a mountain, who's gonna be able to take care of the organization? They just look at me and they go, Simran, I don't know, the CFO, I guess. And my team and I will just look at each other and be like, okay, we're gonna have a fun time writing a recommendation on that. But we also need to talk about the critical business processes. And that could be operations, finance, accounting, human resources, supply chain. Depending on the organization, critical business processes are gonna be very different. And when I started doing consulting, I guess I kind of romanticized executives and working in a big company, and then I started consulting for them, and I realized, you guys don't know what's most important, what would affect the organization, you don't know what your crown jewels are. Interesting. So how do you know that they're backed up? And then we have to start the conversation about, so if something, name a few applications that if they were down, you would not be able to run. You would get a panic attack, things would be slowed down, you would lose a lot of money, your CEO would be on the phone, your board would be upset. Think of those applications, and let's talk about, which one we want to maybe involve into the scenario. And, technology landscape is very important now that everyone's moving to the cloud. Legacy systems pose a great threat, and you'd be surprised how many folks just figured it's not worth the level of effort. And it's not a whole lot of ROI, but you never know. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about around the crown jewels. During a ransomware, if applications are down and we have to slowly start picking those applications up, and you ask an application owner, is your application critical? Their application is going to be critical. Every dev guy thinks their application is critical. This is where at the executive level, right, from the business side, they know what's critical in terms of the bottom dollar, in terms of the operational cost and the impact it happens, where sometimes the executives are making the decision, I want this application. We have to get this application online by the end of the weekend. So then you have to craft ways of scenarios of how to pick that up and be able to securely enclave those systems so they're not being re-encrypted by a potential active attacker.
Yeah, this is also a good opportunity to ask the client, POC, the CISO, whoever you're speaking with, if there's anything that they would like to highlight within the storyline for the tabletop, right? So what I mean by that is, is there anything that is a weakness within your environment, within your program, that maybe you would like to highlight? Maybe you've tried to raise it up to your leadership and they just, haven't really been picking up what you've been putting down. And sometimes you'll get some really interesting answers. They'll start to share a little bit more about the struggles within the organizations and where they think their weak points are. So this is a great opportunity to genuinely have a conversation about the status of the program, the health of the program, and you get to learn about the politics and the interconnections between the organization and maybe some silos. Maybe they've been trying to get something on a roadmap, and they just couldn't get the funding, so it didn't make it. So this is a good time to maybe see if we can help them out in that way. So how to brainstorm and select scenarios. So you really want to start with pinpointing the gaps within the organization. So that really happens quite naturally through the conversations that you'll be having with the organization. And then you want to start to discuss and prioritize that list of gaps. So the best way to do this is to really stay abreast of industry trends and overall trends, and just try to prioritize based on the conversations that you're having and understanding the crown jewels that are associated with the organization, and inquiring whether those crown jewels have the correct technical controls to be safeguarded if there was an attack. Then you want to dig deeper. Usually I start off with a scoping conversation, and then we continue conversations as you're creating the storyline, and you continue to help bring to light issues that need to be resolved, that have been mentioned. And from the tabletop, maybe you can help justify the severity of the issue, and maybe help them get it resolved with funding, with importance. Maybe it turns in the report, part of the report turns into like a board presentation. That's happened many times before. And lastly, you want to outline the scenario and maybe just go over the scenario with someone that we like to call like our insider within the scenario. So they'll be a part of the tabletop exercise when it's happened, but they'll kind of already know what the scenario is like, and they can help move it along and maybe give hints. And that way, you have someone that has a full understanding of the environment, and you can make sure that the storyline really makes sense and it's something that would actually happen within the organization.
And so now we have how to create scenarios. Here's a few examples of scenarios you could do. We've put this across a 2-month span. It could be 3 months or 6 months, but really the whole point is to be able to have multiple topics hit fairly rapidly. And just because what we're seeing, right? You have around whale fishing, which I hate the terminology, by the way, but unfortunately that's what the industry chose, where VIPs and VPs and executives are getting specifically targeted, and they are getting extorted for their data. You have, of course, malicious traffic that you're seeing. What are we seeing in terms of the cloud credential leak? This is something we get from a cloud perspective all the time. Hey, your GitHub repo is now public, credentials have been leaked, or for example, AWS will give you a notification. Your access keys have been saw on the dark web or on the public internet. They'll give you that notification that then can spin up into an instant response of what happens, where is that credential at. And these are all scenarios that you could take in and utilize this as creating a mini tabletop exercise to really dig deeper on the methodology of how your team will assess this scenario and then be able to respond with a lot of the things that are coming about. Third-party compromise. This is something that's huge. There's, of course, with SolarWinds was a big deal in terms of supply chain. But really now, what happens if your NPM package has libraries in there that's been compromised? This is something that happens all the time. Just last week, another 21 GitHub repos with NPM packages had malicious content, that malwares were found, and GitHub put out an advisory. This happens on a daily now. Almost like last year, we had a whole blog about one specific package, but since that last year blog in December that came out, I've probably seen 4 or 5 different articles every month or two where a library package based off an application that you'll probably load is being compromised at the library package level, so not even at the application level. And then, of course, there's an unusual network traffic pattern. So these are all different scenarios, just examples. I mean, like I said, you want to internally, as an organization, you have to pick these scenarios based off of your threat landscape, based off of the trends, right? So there's new trends that are coming out in terms of ransomware, knowing the trends. If I know that from what I'm reading is now VMware ESXi, one of our colleagues, Greg, did a great talk about that, where your ESXi is getting compromised or your backups are getting compromised. Now your Active Directory is totally down. They are shot in the water. How do you rebuild Active Directory? These are all new methods that are trending, right? If you would have asked me 5 years ago, backups, quick, easy, 3-2-1 backup strategy. Now that's not the case, right? So understanding the trends will then help you create these scenarios.
So facilitator responsibilities. I like to tell facilitators, and I like to remind myself and my team that as a good facilitator, you create the scenario and you step back. The less you have to talk, the better it's probably going. So of course you want to start off welcoming the participants, getting people warmed up, getting to know each other, maybe start off with some introductions, and then describe the scope and the objectives of the scenario. At this point, I really like to remind folks that are going to be participating that this is not a test. Please don't treat it as such. There is really no right or wrong answers. Please, use whatever you have, whatever resources. If you have an incident response plan, if you have playbooks that you feel might be relevant, please feel free to take them out. If it is a test, I like to say it's open book. We want you to do exactly what you would do if this was a real life scenario, right? So I know that it's not, so no need to freak out, but please do take this seriously and tell us what you would actually do. And it's okay if you don't know, because the reason we do tabletops is to figure out where the gaps are, to figure out where we can learn lessons proactively and not reactively. And then we start off giving a little bit of a narrative to the participants and set up the story a little bit, cause a little suspense, get them thinking. And throughout the tabletop, you really just want to, ask questions to have them dig deeper and think further through the scenario. And, sometimes within scenarios, we have maybe one person that, is really gung-ho, knows everything, great employee, they're kind of the one that's really taking over the conversation. We like to kind of send that person on PTO, they had a wedding to go to, or they hit the jackpot, they're in Hawaii right now, so who's gonna answer instead? And you really wanna take notes so that you remember all the nitty-gritty details of people's answers and, figure out, if they knew who to escalate to, or, sometimes I like to even take detailed notes on how people seem to be reacting and what they were comfortable speaking about and what they weren't, and, confidence levels, body language, interaction between the different teams. And you just kind of step back and observe gameplay. And after that, you kind of just look at the simulated actions and compare it to whatever documentation the organization might have, because a lot of the times the documentation and what the team would actually do if there was an incident isn't always one-to-one. Sometimes it's apples to oranges, and that's where there's an opportunity to fill a gap.
Yeah, and I have a great story on, you may have an incident response where one guy is just on it. He knows where all the skeletons are. This happens a lot, and actually I just had an IR over the, not this past weekend, a few weekends back, where the recovery, the whole Active Directory is compromised. During the recovery, we're trying to bring up domain controllers, do authoritative restore, things like that. We're doing a lot of work. He has to go to sleep. We want him to go to sleep because we need fresh eyes. The entire time that he was gone for that 8 to 10 hours so he can get some rest and come back, there was no progress in recovery, no progress in remediation. So having that ability to say, what happens if he goes, he has to go to sleep, I'm sorry. We actually implore and we actually tell clients during remediation or during an incident response weekend, please create shifts. We want to be able to have multiple people there to have fresh eyes. Tired eyes is not going to help nobody, right? We want to be able to have multiple people that can take whatever Bob is doing and then just take over and do the same level of work. Now, if that's the scenario, what would happen? And that's a lot of times that we see, and it's usually 1 or 2 people who know where all the skeletons are. And after Bob or Sally are gone, no one else kind of can answer these questions. when we're doing a debrief, and you want to look at, okay, when we're looking at the debrief, we know we've done the facilitated exercise. There's a lot of things to look at, right? How could you have been able to counter this? What preventative measures? Is there any detections that were not in place that we could put in place, or were there detections already happened and alerts were just dropping in a pit of Splunk logs, right? For example, if you have a guard duty alert and that just really litany of guard duty alerts, what would happen there? Maybe we need to go and help prioritize certain alerts. How is the notification process? Do we need to notify third parties? Or if you have customers, you want to notify your customers. How was the scope of the event? Was it based off of the scope of the event sufficient? Or if it started getting into, let's say, data that is only capable of a US citizen, now your team in India or APJ are not able to access that. So now the scope gets larger and we need to go and change the right personnel. And of course, the incident prioritization. We want to know if this incident happens, how are you able to prioritize this and push off everyone else's tasks to be able to rectify this? Because like I said, it's not only IR who is during an incident response. Your operations guy, your sysadmins, if they're working on a project, can we put them on hold? Because we need him for the next 5 to 10, 15 business days. And really around lessons learned. So we kind of did a debrief. We talked about some lessons learned. We want to know detective controls. If there's a way to prevent this from happening, how can we do that? Yesterday I gave a talk around a specific misconfiguration. The misconfiguration was using and leveraging a vulnerability on an application. The vulnerability on an application, that will be patched. There's a new vulnerability that'll come out. How can we prevent this specific scenario from happening from the get-go, which is at the preventative level? How can we prevent something from happening? Are there any tools? Do we have the right level of tools to make our jobs easier? If sometimes you need to buy a tool. A lot of times executives get tool happy. So they'll purchase every tool, yet they don't know how to work them, how to configure them, who has eyes on it to be able to utilize it during an actual incident. That's another thing we come across. And what are some overarching strategic initiatives that has to happen to be able to better understand what's going on?
Okay, so you did the tabletop exercise. Congratulations. Now what? So after you do the tabletop exercise, it really helps if the debrief was good, if people were participating. You want to kind of stir the pot a little bit, get people thinking, get people talking. And usually with the notes from the debrief, you can start creating a roadmap. And you really want to create the roadmap based on prioritization of efforts, right? So like the risk level and the level of effort that it would take. You really want to start off with, figuring out what the quick wins would be and make sure you scatter that within the roadmap, usually within phase 1. And then you want to socialize the roadmap with leadership and obtain buy-in from the key stakeholders. Because that's really how you get the initiatives to actually happen. Because it's one thing being on a roadmap, one thing actually getting it off the roadmap and into fruition, right? So you want to identify a project manager for each initiative on the roadmap to ensure accountability. And then you want to make sure that there's a regular cadence with, the technical, strategic, and, operational leadership. And make sure that there's visibility, there's investment, and there's progress towards an eventual completion. Then you got to really start beginning the transformation efforts with low-hanging fruit. And, consider the multiple milestones. Consider having small check-ins to ensure that you're tracking progress and the security posture is actually being increased and you're getting to a state of maturity where your board, your leadership, and the folks within the SOC really do feel comfortable with the current security posture. And you want to continuously update that roadmap as you continue to do mini tabletop exercises, and there continues to be, different areas of opportunity that the organization can work on internally. And sometimes maybe there'll be too many, and you want to, contact outside help, third parties to, get a tool set up or, reconfigure something, or maybe you want to, put something up for discussion with the board or with different teams. Maybe you need to do some hiring. But continuously updating the roadmap is really important because, as the attack surface continues to expand, you want to continue to learn as an organization and stay intellectually curious and resilient. So the best way to do that is to keep track and continue to do exercises that shows you the true areas of opportunity.
Awesome. We want to take this time. There's a gameplay that I really want everyone to get a chance to do. So this next slide will have a QR code. I assure you it's legit.
We're not going
Don't
to fish
believe
you,
me.
I promise.
There's a slido.com. Put in this code 1943699. We'll give you guys about another 20 seconds.
Yeah.
And we have some nice questions on some questions that can spurn a little bit of the tabletop scenarios. Give it about another 10 more seconds. Yeah, and the top 3 will get a prize. Just see me afterwards. I'll get your contact info. We'll send you some prizes afterwards.
I saw some phones go up after that.
Yeah, I am not playing, so whoever added my name, you better win. I'm just telling you right now.
I don't see a Simran up there, so we're good.
Yeah, they're messing with me. Alrighty, first question.
I got it.
IT admin credentials were stolen and are available on Pastebin. The IR team has been notified. Which action should your analyst perform first? Keyword is first. Look at the logs for recent logins. Reset all passwords. Further research which credentials were stolen specifically, or search the dark web. We're gonna 16 out of 45. I think we don't have enough time for a minute, so we're gonna cut it off at about 15 seconds. All righty, and the answer is reset all passwords. I'm thinking we are. So once again, when you get, this happens a lot actually, we have a lot of IRs that come about this. You want to first figure out if credentials were stolen and are on the public internet. Let's figure out what credentials there are. Are they legitimate? Are they active credentials? And understand the scope. So further research the credentials and figure out, sometimes it could be old. Like let's say if you have your access key has been put on the internet, it's a AWS access key, but it's an Asia access key, ASIA. You don't really care about that. It's probably been expired because it's been out for 10 hours or 15 hours or 2 days. Yeah. If it's IKEA key, it's a long-term credential, that's something you want to look at. Mm-hmm. All right. And the attacker was able to obtain an MFA response via a push to the IT admin late at night. What would have prevented the attacker from receiving a false MFA response? Alerting on out-of-office hours, remove push MFA and require OTP, alert on logins from different geolocations, or remove the ability to validate without facial scan or fingerprint. Remember, what would have prevented the attack? And give it another 10 more seconds. Come on now, you guys can do this. Only 32? All righty. What do you guys think? Love to see that. So remember, the key is preventing, right? That was a key. There's things on alerting and detecting. If we would have said detection and alerts, alerting on out of office hours, different geolocations, those are all ways to prevent, to detect it, but we're looking at prevention. And yes, you definitely want to be able to remove MFA push, especially for IT admins.
So the attacker is attempting to perform a Kerberos attack. What event ID should the IRA team look for? 4769, 4624, 4625, or 4772?
This one we went a little bit in the weeds, which we like to do sometimes. But as part of, this is the questions that we'll ask. Like, hey, there's a detection on Kerberos attacks happening from your SIM platform or from your EDR. How can we validate? What are the event IDs you'll be looking at? And what are some of the parameters you want to check for? Okay, we are just almost at the time, and this is going to be good to see. Alrighty, and... Okay, so it's actually 4769 is when the Kerberos ticket is requiring So what you'll see during curb roast, so normally you'll get a user have 10 to 15 throughout a day. A curb roast attack, you'll see a span of them happening in like 15 minutes, a lot of it happening. And you want to look at specifically on the encryption type, 0x17, which is the different types of encryptions, which is the easier ones to bypass as opposed to 0x12, which is AES 256, or 0x11, which is AES 128. And we are out of time. And let's see who is the winner. We have a few people tied for, so I guess 1, 2, and 3.
Maybe do
See me.
split it up.
I guess no. I think we 1, 2, and 3. We said top 3. They have the same.
There
So
you
I
go.
guess you guys are there.
Congratulations.
If you're Mandiant, you don't get it. If you're Mandiant,
Oh man.
you're not getting it. Non-Mandiant personnel. Forgot to put that in there. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.